Energy access practitioners, researchers, consultants, and policymakers, welcome. This is a recorded information session about work done by the Renewable Energy for African Agriculture Project, or RE4AFAGRi for short. RE4AFAGRi is a project implemented by the International Institute for Applied Systems Analysis, the Polytechnic University of Turin, IIASA Consulting, in the universities of Zambia, Rwanda, and Cape Town, and TFE. The project is geared towards improving planning models for small electrification in Africa. RE4AFAGRi forms part of LEAP-RE, which is the long-term research and innovation partnership on renewable energy between the European Union and the African Union. Funding has been provided by the EU's Horizon 2020 Research and Innovation Programme. My name is André Troost, the consulting lead at TFE, based in Cape Town, South Africa. TFE is a distributed renewable energy finance and business model consultancy working in sub-Saharan Africa, and we have been leading RE4AFAGRi's work on business models and the techno-economics of smallholder agriculture. So what is all this work about? It starts with the realization that smallholder farmers are the breadbasket of sub-Saharan Africa. They are responsible for 80% of the region's agricultural output. Yet, despite their critically important role, they are often neglected, living outside the reach of critical infrastructure. Electricity, which plays a vital role in agricultural productivity, remains especially elusive. 80% of the region's rural population are smallholder farmers, and only 29% of this population has access to electricity. So accelerating the pace of electrification would require a fundamental shift in how electrification interventions, especially those in rural areas, are designed and implemented. This work seeks to introduce such a paradigm shift. We introduce the concept of user-led electrification interventions using renewable energy, and also offer approaches for how these can be designed and implemented in the context of the agri-energy nexus. What we mean by user-led is that the pricing of products and businesses and the business models that they use to sell those products are fundamentally based on the needs and ability to pay of smallholder farmers. Energy access business models are often designed with a wide variety of potential use cases in mind. There's nothing wrong with that. But given that such a large number of people living in unelectrified regions in sub-Saharan Africa are smallholder farmers, it makes sense to design energy access business models around agriculture. And we also know how important productive users are for the economics of rural energy access interventions. There's this well-known Pareto principle that says that about 80% of revenue from mini-grids, for example, come from only 20% of the users, and these are the productive users. So it's important to focus on these customers. And of course, agriculture is a key productive use in rural areas. So finally, when we design business models around agricultural activities, and we also electrify those activities cost effectively, then the success of rural energy access interventions could be increased. But the question remains, how do we identify financially viable electrification opportunities? And this is where our techno-economic model comes in. So the model that I will present today is designed to identify agricultural value chain activities that are financially viable for electrification from the perspective of the smallholder farmer. What makes this model different from other models? Well, we started from the premise that, as George Box famously said, all models are wrong, but some are useful. So we designed and developed a model that is not necessarily perfect, but is at least a bit more useful than most financial models out there that are used for identifying electrification opportunities. That increased utility comes from the inclusion of a much wider set of variables than what most models incorporate. For example, it is sensitive to the prices of different crops, and incorporates different scenarios of seasonality and crop rotation. Also different scenarios on the usage of machinery per day and also across seasons. The main value add is methodological. So it's a tool that you can use to calculate the financial viability of electrifying certain agro-processing and irrigation activities in your area. As a secondary value add, we ourselves, through extensive research, have pre-populated the model with indicative data to provide example insights on techno-economic viability of processing and irrigation activities across key value chains in Nigeria, Rwanda, Zambia, and Zimbabwe. The model revolves around the central equation of marginal profit versus capital expenditure. It then continues from the acknowledgement that marginal profit is calculated by marginal revenue minus marginal cost. And what do we mean when we say marginal revenue and marginal cost? Well, this is what is explained in the table on the slide. Marginal revenue is defined as the additional revenue enabled by the irrigation or processing activity. So this is revenue directly related to the usage of that irrigation machine, the pump, or a processing machine. It does not include revenue that they would have in any case. How do we calculate this? Well, for irrigation activities, we multiply the price margin, so the additional margin that they are able to achieve by virtue of the solar water pump, which comes from the increased quality of the crop, and multiplied by the yield, so the additional yield. So we all know, of course, that if a farmer ensures that his or her crops has access to sufficient water, that the yields will also increase. For agro-processing activities, how do we calculate that? Well, that comes down to firstly the throughput per hour. So that is the amount of kilograms that the farmer can process per hour. And that is a function of the theoretical throughput that the machine can handle, but also the availability of unprocessed crops that can be processed in an hour. So there's theoretical throughput and realistic throughput. That is multiplied by the number of hours that that machine operates per day, and also the price margin. So once again, we know that processed crops achieve a higher price than unprocessed crops. And in this case, we use the margin that the farmer can employ. Marginal cost, this refers to the ongoing costs of performing the irrigation and processing activity. So that costs would include things like the transportation of the crops to the market, the salaries of the operators of the pumps or the machines, maintenance costs, and very importantly, electricity. Now, as you will see in the model, and as I'll explain a bit later, for standalone solar water pumps, the ongoing cost of electricity is zero because the solar asset, the solar panel, is embedded into the product. And so electricity is not bought on an ongoing basis in order to run the pump. But the cost of ongoing electricity is variable for grid and mini-grid electricity, because in this case, if the pump or the machine is connected to one of these two, the grid or a mini-grid, ongoing electricity would need to be bought by the farmer. So allow me to take us straight to a deep dive into how the model works in its Excel-based format. First, I will run us through the different slides, rather the different sheets, into how the model is structured, and then we can jump straight into an example. The first sheet is the main inputs sheet. And this is where you populate the model with input data. This data is automatically used by the model to calculate the outputs, which I will explain in a moment. The main inputs sheet is structured to ingest data of 3 staple crop value chains and 1 horticultural value chain across up to 4 countries. So in this case, for example, we have maize, cassava, and rice as staple crops. And then we also have tomato as a horticultural crop. And this is done across 4 countries: Nigeria, Rwanda, Zambia, and Zimbabwe. Remember, as I explained just now, that this data is just indicative. It's to provide an example of how the model can function. The data is as accurate as possible, but the main value add that we have here is the logical value add of having this tool. And you'll see that we have maize, cassava, and rice from Nigeria, but we have selected value chains across the different countries based on the number of smallholder farmers that are operational in those value chains. So in Rwanda, the value chains that have the most smallholder farmers active was maize, cassava, and beans. In Zambia, it was maize, cassava, and groundnuts. And in Zimbabwe, it was sorghum, groundnuts, and maize. These color-coded cells are those that you can edit. For example, you're requested to modify the number of hours that the equipment will be operational, across how many months per year the equipment will be used, if the equipment will be connected to the grid, what is the tariff, the same stuff for mini grid, and multiple other questions. You can also insert the names of the countries and the value chains. So if you, for example, rather want to model your local conditions in Senegal, you can, and you perhaps want to model for something other than maize, let's say, for example, groundnuts, you can do just that. And obviously ingest the model with accurate data. Cells that are white are automatic calculations that in turn automatically feed into the output sheets. You should try and accurately populate all modifiable cells, the color-coded ones, to ensure accurate outputs in the respective output sheets. These are the payback period results and the IRR results. And as I mentioned, we'll get there in a second. So remember, garbage in, garbage out, as the old saying goes. The second sheet, price margin inputs, collects information about the price margin that the smallholder farmer generates as a result of operating a solar water pump in the case of irrigation, or a dryer in the case of maize drying, a sheller in the case of shelling, and so forth. You can populate this data in one of 2 ways, either by subtracting the price per kilogram of a crop that has not been irrigated or processed from the crop price with access to the pump or machine. Or the second way is by skipping this calculation and just directly inserting the margin if you already know what it is. So remember, as I said earlier, the crop price with the activity will always be higher because of the added quality that is enabled by access to water through irrigation or the crop being processed as a result of agro-processing machinery. It's always higher than what would have been the case without access to that pump or machine. And what we're trying to calculate here is the difference, because we want to know what is the marginal value add of using that pump or machine. And so now that we have the margin, that price margin serves as an input into the annual marginal revenue calculations in the payback period results sheet. And speaking of which, that takes us to the payback period results sheet, the first output sheet. Payback in months in row 27 expresses the number of months it would take the smallholder farmer to recover the cost of the equipment. For agro-processing activities, you're able to select whether the equipment is powered by a mini-grid or by the grid in row 30. There's a drop-down. As our parallel report explained, which is also available on the RE4AFAGRi website, standalone solar agro-processing is still nascent. So selection of standalone, in this case, as an electricity source, will lead to an error message. In the case of irrigation, only standalone, take that back. In the case of irrigation, only standalone as an electricity source is regarded by the model as valid due to this being the preferable power source for irrigation. Once again, as explained in our report, and if you want to read a bit more about that, feel free to navigate to section 1.1 in that report, which, as I mentioned, is available on the RE4AFAGRi website. In row 32, the model asks you to select an irrigation scenario. You'll be presented with 4 options as follows. Firstly, the no scenario. This means that there is that the farmer now has access to irrigation, but they still opt not to have a second season of crop cultivation. So this means that there's only use of irrigation during the rainy season, which obviously would not happen that often because it is the rainy season after all. So needless to say, this no scenario is not a very realistic scenario. The second scenario, monocultivation, refers to 2 seasons of staple crop cultivation enabled by year-round access to irrigation. Now, of course, the farmer has access to water across the board. They can now, if in the case of a maize, as we have here, they can now grow maize in the rainy season, being dependent on rain, and also irrigation in cases where there might be a few dry days in the rainy season, but also in the dry season because they have now access to water, provided, of course, that there is a form of water storage facility also available. And this is a relatively good scenario, but it is not as good as the third scenario, which is what we have currently selected, is crop rotation. And this, again, refers to year-round irrigation, but it's diversified through 1 season with staple crop and 1 other with horticulture. And our test case for horticulture in this example is tomatoes, listed here. So if I can show an example of what that would look like, currently it takes the smaller farmer only 1.43 years to pay back the initial capital expenditure of the pump because they are growing maize in, let's say, 1 season and horticulture in other season. And we know horticulture is a cash crop. So tomatoes is a cash crop. So it means that there will be a higher price achieved for the sale of that crop. But let's say the farmer opts only to sell maize and thus selects the monocultivation scenario. It would increase the payback period from 1.43 years to 4.14 years, just by virtue of having reduced income annually. And the least advisable scenario, of course, would be the no scenario, where the farmer only grows maize once per year. And you can see in this case, the model says that year on year, we make actually a loss. And so in this case, there is absolutely no reason for the supplier to sell a solar water pump to this farmer because there will be no way in which the farmer will be able to recover the capital expenditure. So you can see how the type of usage really becomes a catalyst and a facilitator for how profitable or unprofitable the endeavor would be. So let's just take this back to the crop rotation scenario. We also have a fourth irrigation scenario, which is year-round horticulture. This again refers to year-round irrigation, but in this case, there's no cultivation of staple crops, only cultivation of horticulture. So in both seasons of cultivation, the farmer selects to cultivate, in this case, in our case, tomatoes. Right. So this scenario is only selectable in the different horticulture columns in the sheet, which is columns P in the case of Nigeria, AB in the case of Rwanda, yep, column AQ in the case of Zambia. So this is the column we actually navigate just to the cell, year-round horticulture irrigation, and column BE in the case of Zimbabwe, year-round horticulture irrigation. Now, as a way of comparison, to show what an effect this will have on the cost recovery of a solar water pump, we see that in the crop rotation scenario where the farmer grows maize for one season and tomatoes the second season, it takes them 1.43 years to pay back the pump. But in the case of the year-round horticulture irrigation, or rather, year-round horticulture irrigation scenario, it will only take them 0.84 years to pay back that. This is only more of a theoretical scenario because we know that smaller farmers generally do not only grow cash crops because the local community tends to have a demand for more stable crops. And so for a farmer to only grow tomatoes, they would have to be very, very directly linked with more downstream urban markets where there is a larger demand, at least in larger numbers, for cash crops like tomatoes. So that wraps up the overview of the payback period results sheet. The final final output sheet is the NPV and the IRR sheets, the net present value and the internal rate of return. And this sheet runs in parallel to sheet 3, and which is the payback period results sheet, of course, and serves as our second output sheet. The sheet calculates the NPV and IRR from the initial capital outlay and the subsequent income year on year for 10 years. So this is an assumption once again. It assumes that the machine or the pump operates for 10 years after it has been purchased. Once again, when you populate this model with your own data, you will best know what the life span of the equipment will be, given its quality and given the way it is used. And as per standard financial modeling, if the net present value is positive, then the investment is regarded as profitable. Now, the model is automatically designed to provide a profitable or loss-making message. Like we see here in the case of cassava irrigation in Nigeria, the net present value is negative due to the fact that there is an annual loss being made on the operation of the pump, which means that there's no internal rate of return and it is a loss-making activity. So the remaining sheets, what are the remaining sheets? The remaining sheets are the irrigation inputs and calculations. Calculating inputs for the irrigation results is slightly more complicated, which is why we have additional calculation sheets. And you as the user would always also have to navigate to this sheet to input some critical data. So the third, and these sheets are the same between the different countries. It asks for the same data. The first table on each sheet is for information only, so it does not pull into any calculation, where you can insert data pertaining to technical specifications and other details about the solar water pump being modeled. The next section automatically calculates yield increases in staple crops as a result of irrigation, drawing on your inputs pertaining to how many months in the year the farmer uses the pump in the monocultivation and crop rotation scenarios, respectively, whether there's only one season or two seasons in the year during which irrigation is carried out, estimated differences between rain-fed yield and irrigated yield, and so forth. The sheet then displays automatic calculations towards generating outputs for the marginal annual revenue that the smallholder farmer will experience as a result of irrigation in each scenario. So the no second season, the monocultivation scenario. So this is the case for this box. And then also for the crop rotation scenario, the scenario 3, and finally scenario 4, use year-round irrigated horticulture. This all sounds complicated, but don't worry. You are only required to insert average yield and price of irrigated crop in the horticulture scenario, seeing that these data for this indicated in the other 3 scenarios are already inserted one step earlier. So just saying that again, only here at these 2 points for the horticulture scenario are you requested to input the price for the irrigated horticulture and the average yield for horticulture. The data that you would need to provide for the automatic calculations for the other scenarios, you can already pull from the other sheet, as well as some user inputs in this sheet, in this section right here. So let us take a quick example to see how our data flows for a specific use case. So we can take one agro-processing example and one irrigation example. If we take agro-processing, we use maize drying. So for maize drying, we first have obviously the produce sale. So what is the income that the farmer generates from using the maize drying machine? And that is calculated. That you can always just look at the formula to see where the source of information comes from. So in this case, it's main inputs D25 multiplied by main inputs D23. So we go to D25 on main inputs, D25. We see it is the realistic machinery throughput. So remember, this is what I mentioned earlier about the realistic kilograms that can go through a given agro-processing machine. So here we go. It's based on the possible throughput that can be delivered. So this is, for example, where we have placed in the data. So it appears in the realistic machinery throughput. It is then multiplied by the operating hours, which also is based on, remember, these are all automatic calculations. So these are just calculated based on the inputs that you have provided above. So the number of hours that machine operates across the year. And the final piece of the puzzle is, if we go back to the formula, is the price margins D8. So we go to price margins, we see maize, we go to D8. This is the price margin I mentioned earlier, the marginal increase in income that the farmer achieves through operating the maize drying machine. So then we have the revenue per year that is facilitated by the operation of the maize drying machine. Now we go to the marginal cost. We have the transportation of the crops to the market, which is once again pulling from the main input sheet. So main inputs C11 times C9. So we go back here, we see C9. What is the current price of liter per diesel times what is the fuel consumption of the vehicle that delivers the crops to the market? And then once again, this is all based on some assumptions. It will obviously vary widely, very, very widely. And that calculation is multiplied in turn by a multiplication between the main input sheet C10, what is the distance from the farm to the market and back? And that is then finalized by a multiplication of 48 because there are 48 weeks per year. So this is all based on weekly data. So we go back here just to explain that. We go to C10, what is the distance and what is the price of liter per diesel, per liter of diesel, and the rest follows. This then takes us to labor, which once again is just the straight labor cost from the main input sheet. Maintenance, again, you can always just follow this indication of where the data comes from if you want to follow up on that. And then electricity, this is a header almost, one can say, for the two rows that follow. It says that if the user has selected a mini grid year, the electricity cost will pull from the mini grid row. So it will mean that $18 is per year is the mini grid cost. But if let's say we click on grid, then $3 will be selected in the appropriate row. So just taking it back to mini grid because we are modeling for a more off-grid scenario. All of these costs, transport cost, labor, maintenance, and electricity is then added together to get your total costs. That's subtracted from total revenues, and we get our marginal profit. And once again, as we said earlier, then this automatic calculation ensues where the payback period is calculated relative to the upfront cost. So this then also takes us to IRR. We see the same approach here. If we go back to the same example of maize drying, it is the initial capital expense, which these are all automatic functions, and that then is followed by the annual profit. And the NPV is the automatic Excel function. The IRR is also an automatic Excel function. And then obviously an automatic message that is provided by the model to say whether the product or whether the endeavor is profitable or not. So taking us then to an irrigation example, let's use the case of maize irrigation. This is a slightly more complicated scenario. And the produce sales takes its data not from the main input sheet that much as is the case with agro-processing activities that you can see there, but rather it takes the data from the irrigation and inputs and calculations sheet. So not too complicated, but if one would click on, if the user yourself, you would click on in the irrigation scenario, this is what is really important here. If you click on the crop rotation scenario, it will provide the crop rotation annual revenue. But if you can see there, $2,441 per year. But if we change it to no, so only one season, it will drop down to $341. And all that is really happening is that this information is pulled from the irrigation input and calculations sheet, this sheet. So we have seen that for the crop rotation scenario, there is produce sales of 2,441. And in the function, we will see that the function says if the user clicks on crop rotation, so if C32 equals crop rotation, then the model will provide data from the irrigation inputs and calculations sheet, specifically cell B41. So if I can take us there and see what that looks like, it is like here again is the value, $2,441. So in these auto calculation tables on this irrigation sheets, the actual marginal revenue of different irrigation scenarios is automatically calculated. So this is the 341 that I showed earlier, which is for the no, 1,363 for monocultivation, 2,441 for monocultivation, and 3,518 for year-round horticulture. So now that we have covered the question of how to identify financially viable electrification opportunities, we move on to the notion of designing business models that can lead to operational success. 3 business models are especially noteworthy: pay-as-you-go, keymaker, and community-centered. So the pay-as-you-go model can either be a lease-to-own model or service-based pay-as-you-go models. In a lease-to-own model, really what happens is that the asset or the product becomes the under ownership of the smallholder farmer after a certain period of repayment or installments being made. Service-based pay-as-you-go models is a perpetual lease model, one can say, where essentially the smallholder farmer only pays for the energy that they consume from using the asset. So the asset is never transferred to the ownership of the smallholder farmer. So both of these options are very useful to circumvent the problem of high upfront costs. Like we have shown in the model, there are certain aspects that we can look at in order to identify financial viable electrification opportunities. But what we still sit with is the problem that that initial capital expense must be paid by the farmer. And so that's what these business models really seek to do. It's really to circumvent that issue and enable the farmer to really to pay for an asset on the schedule that suits him or her. The keymaker model is a second business model that we have analyzed to a great degree. And year experience has shown that expanding electricity access, together with financing of irrigation and processing equipment, as I've explained now with the different pay-as-you-go lease options, is not necessarily a sufficient condition for enabling income growth and employment generation within a rural community. Smallholder farmers are typically located in hard-to-reach rural areas, and this means they typically have limited connections with downstream market actors, and transporting crops over long distances and low-quality roads is challenging. These barriers reduce the ability of smallholder farmers to find suitable offset points for their crops that are now of higher quality and in larger volumes, thanks to irrigation and agro-processing. Consequently, smallholders' crops are typically sold in the local market of the surrounding area. Thus, as a third measure, a service that enables farmers to sell their crops in downstream markets can improve linkages between the farmer and these markets. And this is what the keymaker model essentially tries to do. essentially the mini grid operator or the energy service provider in which other shape or form, serves as the link between the farmer and the downstream market. They can either purchase the crops from the farmer and serve as an offtaker and then sell in the downstream market, or provide services to the farmer really in order to allow for physical linking to the downstream market and also network linking, so putting them in touch with suitable downstream markets. This is what the Keymaker model seeks to do. And there are very successful stories of this model coming out of the likes of Tanzania and Nigeria. As a third measure, energy access interventions can also benefit from a balance of responsibilities between the community and the private supplier of electricity. The benefits include, for the developer, on-site presence of local agents or technicians that reduce the site visit travel requirements and associated costs. Local community members receive skills training and can be locally employed to conduct paid activities on behalf of the developer. For example, troubleshooting of issues that customers are experiencing with their systems. Local technical upskilling and increased local incomes improve livelihoods and stimulate local economic activity. And increased economic activity may increase energy demand and improve ability to pay, thereby catalyzing this virtuous cycle of rural development. So these are the business models that we've explored and I'll further elaborate upon in the report. We've also looked at the macro environment in which these business models really sit and are influenced by. First of which is regulations. So we've discussed already that mini-grids and off-grid solar are the typical energy systems that are used to provide irrigation and agro-processing services to smallholder farmers in the region. And so regulations that affect these energy technologies are of note. Mini-grid regulations, for example, is often can make or break a sector. There are things pertaining to grid encroachment, where if a grid arrives at a mini-grid site, what then should be done. Clarity around that is very important, and multiple other factors. Regulations that affect off-grid solar products is less important because the technology is more characteristic of a fast-mover consumer good. So the regulations often is limited to quality standards. And so there's less of a need to have detailed clarity regulations on things compared to grid encroachment. Value-added tax and import duties and other taxes are also of note in the regulatory side of things because that really affects how the product is priced. Financing, commercial financing is largely absent in the sector in most countries, and most local commercial banks are unfamiliar with energy access technologies. As a result, local currency interest rates offered to these companies tend to be above 20% in local currency. Tenors tend to be short, and collateral requirements tend to be quite long and extensive. Donor support programs partially fill this funding gap by offering concession finance, but there's much more needed in order to scale up the sector. We've also looked quite intricately at the digital and physical infrastructure, using, again, the case studies of the 4 countries, Nigeria, Rwanda, Zambia, and Zimbabwe. Good. On the digital side of things, mobile cellular subscriptions and mobile money is particularly noteworthy because without digital technologies, business models, the likes of pay-as-you-go, would not really be scalable. And this requires really that smaller farmers own mobile cellular devices and subscriptions. So we've looked at the data around that. We've looked also at the prevalence of mobile money usage because that really eases the transaction burden for everyone involved. So thank you very much for watching. That is a whistle-stop tour of the work that we have done in this project. We've looked quite intricately at the model, quite specifically. We, at a higher level, discussed the business models that are accompanying the need for identifying financially viable electrification opportunities with the use of the model. And we hope that this work can catalyze further growth in the sector and really benefit the work and the impact delivered by companies selling very, very important and necessary energy services to smaller farmers on the ground. Remember, all of these resources are downloadable from our website, RE4AFAGRi.Africa. And if you have any questions or any comments, do get in touch with us, and we will gladly discuss and perhaps assist with further tutorials on the usage of the model. Thank you for your time.